Ну что ж, мы рады всех приветствовать, всех, кто нашел время и присоединился к нам. Интеллектуальное сообщество «Партизаны, культуры», медиахаб «Бодлер» при содействии катедры медиакомуникаций Харьковского национального университета имени Каразіна. Большое спасибо Лидии Владимировне Стародубцевой. Вот. И мы сегодня собрались для того, чтобы послушать профессора Гумбрехта, почесного профессора Харківського університету, філософа, теоретика культури. И мы безмерно благодарны профессору Гумбрехту за то, что он нашел время, возможность и согласился на наше предложение прочесть сегодня лекцию. Лекция на тему «Рискованное мышление и гуманитарные науки». Оксана.
Да, также профессор Гумбрехт еще просил отметить, что он в настоящее время еще преподает в Еврейском университете в Иерусалиме, что для него очень важно. Вот, это из того, что мы не знали, когда писали программу нашего мероприятия. Также он автор многочисленного перечня прекрасной и важной литературы. Давайте, чтобы сократить время, назову те, которые в переводе есть на украинский. Это «Похвала спортивній красі», «Продукування присутності» и «Разладнаний час». А также недавно, буквально вот на днях, у него вышла книга, которая еще не переведена, но мы ее так по-своему перевели, как «Проза світу» Дені Дидро и «Периферия просветництва». Вот. Чтобы быстрее начать, потому что у профессора очень ограниченное количество времени, а нам еще нужно провести сессию с вопросами, мы начинаем. Попрошу всех, кто не спикер, выключить микрофончики, и потом, когда уже начнется сессия с вопросами и ответами, уже будете тянуть ручки, я думаю, все знают, где находится эта кнопка, и задавать вопросы. Если кто-то не знает английского, чтобы задать, можете писать или говорить, и я переведу для вас. Начинаем.
И просьба формулировать вопросы крайне лаконично, чтобы больше людей успели задать свои вопросы.
Да.
Меньше комментариев, четкие вопросы. Спасибо.
So, let's begin.
Okay, now it's my turn. Okay. Well, I want to start thanking Vadim and Roxana and whoever works in this working group that you told me about in the Boдлер hub at Kiev for the interest in my work. At the beginning, when we first emailed, it wasn't quite clear to me what was meant, but now I see that there's a real interest, and I never take that for granted that people are interested in what I'm producing. As for me, as I already told you, my new friends at Kiev, I'm certainly very eager to return to Ukraine in person, in present. I mean, to Kiev, to Kharkiv, which is the town I know best, University of Kharkiv in Ukraine, but also to the Black Sea, to Odessa, etc., etc. So I mean, one shouldn't say that. It sounds like prostitution or intellectual prostitution, but please do re-invite me in person to Ukraine. Now, more specifically, from early on in our email, I think we have been mailing Vadim and I. Vadim seems to be the director of this Boдлер hub for half a year. It seemed that what Vadim was most interested in my work, or maybe what seemed to be the most urgent discussion, was a discussion about, well, let me say it in a very dramatic fashion, about the survival of the humanities. Survival of the humanities, meaning that there's something at stake for the humanities. Let me give you an undramatic version of the survival of the humanities. I mean, the humanities, what you call in German, the Geisteswissenschaften, the cluster of disciplines that we call the humanities, les sciences humaines in French, etc., like any, I mean, they are an institution. And like any institution in human history, they have a beginning. I mean, the humanities, avant la lettre, those disciplines that we call today the humanities, had their beginning in the early 19th century in Central Europe. And I mean, it's banal to say, any institution that has a beginning will come to its ending. Yeah. And the question whether the humanities are now close to their ending or whether they will come to their ending, in that sense, is a neutral question. But more specifically, you could certainly say that the humanities today, compared to 50 years ago, are in a more dramatic situation. I've been formulating that in an article I recently published in a Swiss daily newspaper by saying, and I believe it, if by some decision of UNESCO or God knows what, or some worldwide emperor or dictator, the humanities would disappear tomorrow completely, nobody outside the humanities would notice that. Yeah? I mean, I think this was not quite the case, let's say in the 1960s, 1970s, if I can remember well, but today the humanities are in a precarious situation. I will try and talk about that, but I mean, and that's a precarious situation for survival. If you think nobody will notice if you die, then you might as well die. You get my point. So this is, I will try and give you an answer to this question, whether the humanities can claim to fulfill a certain function that is important enough to assure their survival. I will not claim, as many colleagues do, that they're indispensable, that humankind and human life would not be possible without the humanities. I will try to go on a very realistic level. I mean, can't they be considered important enough for the moment being that the investment, it costs something to maintain the humanities, people receive salaries, can be maintained. I will do that on two different levels in the next 35 minutes or so. The first level is relatively conventional. I will give you a very short history of the humanities. And if you tell a history, you normally arrive at a present, and you can do a diagnostic of this present. What is not conventional about it is that, to my knowledge, there are not many histories about the humanities. I know no good book that presents the history of the humanities. So if you, I mean, I'm not saying I'm the only and first person who ever tries that, but it's conventional in the sense you tell a history in order to ask what's the present situation, but it's not conventional in the sense that there are not many histories of the humanities. The more unconventional answer is my answer. I'll try to give you an answer by explaining this concept of riskful thinking, which, as far as I know, is my own concept. I mean, it's actually a little bit a weird concept because the word riskful doesn't completely exist in American English, but I mean, it's thinking with risk. Pensée de risque, risikoreiches Denken in German, or whatever. So I will develop this concept, and as far as I know, this is my only answer. Now, this is above all for Roxana. I mean, so I'll talk for some 35, 40 minutes, which will leave us some time for questions and answers. But let me say this, if at some point, as what I'm saying is relatively compact, you feel that you will not be able to understand my next point, my next argument, if I do not make clearer or explain better what I've been previously been saying, then please interrupt me via Roxana, or if you, Roxana, have this feeling, or if you, Vadim, have this feeling that I've not made clear my point, do interrupt me. I prefer to need more time and to know at least at the end that more or less what I wanted to say became clear than having a long discussion. Also, this should be just questions of understanding. If you think you completely understand what I'm saying, but what I'm saying is completely stupid or scandalous, then wait for the discussion. Yeah, this is only interrupt me via Roxana and Vadim if you feel I have not made clear what I want to say. Okay? So that would be our contract. And I mean, if you do interrupt me from time to time, I take that as a good sign. I don't take this as impoliteness. I take this as a sign that you're really following what I'm trying to say. Okay, here's a brief history of the humanities. I mean, my students used to say that I'm a decimal fetishist. I will always announce I make so and so many points. My Brazilian friends know that well. So this is a history of the humanities in 6 points. My first point is that the academic disciplines that we call humanities today, Sciences Humaines, Geisteswissenschaften, etc., that cluster of disciplines, they all started in the early 19th century, but they started to use a French word avant la lettre. Yeah, for the first 100 years of the existence of these disciplines, they were not brought together. They didn't think of themselves as a unit. They didn't think of themselves as sciences humaines. That word didn't exist. And in a strange way, and I will explain that later, that first century was maybe the successful, maybe the happy century of the humanities. But again, I insist, it was a century before the invention of the name and before the invention of an institutional framework that brought the humanities together. Yeah? You can, for example, say that the first university chair ever created for what we call today literary studies was institutionalized at the University of Marburg, north of Frankfurt, in 1813 and was occupied by one of the two Grimm brothers. You can, for example, say that what we call today classics or classical philology was first institutionalized in the 1820s in France. Yeah, I mean, Latin was always important at the university. Greek began to become important, ancient Greek, in the 18th century, but there hadn't been institutions. I mean, history was taught in a different way. Philosophy was taught in a different way. My claim is the humanities start in the early 19th century. Second point, how can one explain that all of a sudden these disciplines emerge? I mean, these disciplines emerged and chairs and institutes were created, not because there was a function. I mean, I tried to reconstruct a function. And I have two hypotheses that I think are convergent. The one hypothesis has to do with the beginning of bourgeois societies, with the bourgeois revolutions in the 18th century. Yeah? I mean, a bourgeois revolution, think of the French Revolution, 1789, think of the American Revolution, 1774, think of the Glorious Revolution in England, even earlier. These revolutions came with a promise. Those new republics, those new states, they promised something to their citizens. They promised a better life to their citizens. But at the same time, and this is what happened after 1800 more or less, the citizens realized that these new republics, these new states, these new societies did not really keep their promises. So there was a tension between what these bourgeois revolutions had promised and what the citizens were experiencing in everyday life. And my hypothesis is, this was not the program of the new humanities, that the humanities, by interpreting texts, by interpreting the past, by making philosophical arguments, they created a kind of transcendence. They created a sphere of values within which the expectation towards those new republics, towards those new societies, and the real experience could be reconciled. So you could say they fulfilled to a certain degree an ideological, a political function of which they were not aware. Is that clear, what I'm saying? So have everybody understood that? A second hypothesis that converges is from one of the best thinkers of literary theory I'm aware of. This is Wolfgang Iser, spelled Iser, I-S-E-R. He's the author of one of the best books that I know in literary theory, The Act of Reading. But he said once about the humanities, and I like that in the 19th century, aesthetic experience progressively occupied the place in bourgeois society that religion had formerly played. You could say since the 19th century, art, the reception of art, reading literature, going to the opera, fulfilled the function of religion, and that those disciplines called the humanities fulfilled the role of the new theology. So let's see, if reading literature becomes the new religion, then literary studies is the theology of this religion. Yeah? If thinking about the national past fulfills the role of religion, then the department of history is the theology of that. Is that clear? So I think in both cases, you could say that the humanities fulfilled a certain function of providing a transcendental horizon of reference in bourgeois societies. And I want to emphasize that they were very successful in doing so. I mean, the prestige of those humanities avant la lettre was never greater than in the 19th century. Let me give you one example. I mean, since the foundation, you know that Germany did not exist as a state before 1871. The foundation of the first German state is after the Franco-Prussian War. And so since 1871, every year, the German emperor gave a speech to the nation on New Year. From the 1880s on, he alternated. It was one year the emperor, the other year a professor of Latin and ancient Greek, Moritz Möllendorf, gave that speech. Can you imagine today? I mean, the American president or the president of Ukraine would never alternate with one of us in giving the speech to the nation. So the humanities had an enormous prestige in the 19th century. And this is why I'm saying, and this is my second point, this was the happy age of the humanities, avant la lettre. Third point, it is interesting to see that in the 1890s, I will mainly refer to Berlin, but similar things happen in Paris, similar things happen at the top American universities, at Harvard, which at that point is already 300 years old, no, not 300 years old, but 200 years old, at Yale, at Princeton, et cetera, et cetera. The university administrations begin to think about these disciplines for the first time. And in Berlin, it is in 1895 at the university, which today is called the Humboldt-Universität, that all these disciplines are brought together in one facultät, as you say in Germany, in one school, as you would say in England or the United States. And that school is called Geisteswissenschaft, sciences of the spirit. Similar things happen in France, similar things happen in England. I mean, it's a nation, in Western culture, it's a typical moment. They become a cluster of disciplines, and then people think about what are they doing? What's their point of convergence? What's their common denominator? The dean that makes this movement at Berlin is Wilhelm Dilthey, a philosopher. Wilhelm Dilthey, who invents the name Sciences of the Spirit, Geisteswissenschaften. And it is Wilhelm Dilthey who says the function of the Geisteswissenschaften, the common denominator, is interpretation. What these humanities are good at is interpreting. The point I want to make is, however, that since this reflection started, since the humanities became an institution, a cluster, their happy days are over. Since that time, maybe because interpretation is not a very convincing answer. I mean, so does society need interpretation? Since that time, people in the humanities, professors at the humanities, have been over eager to answer the question of what humanities are good for. They have been very skeptical about themselves. And I think this explains precisely my fourth point, the fourth point that one could call the original sin of the humanities. Because the humanities professors so badly wanted to fulfill a function, they were ready in the fascist countries, above all in Germany, but also in the communist countries, above all in the Soviet Union, not all of them, but too many of them, to provide any ideological nourishment that these states wanted. Yeah, I mean, to give you one example, there is a very horrible 2-volume collection of essays by very, very famous Germanists from the 1930s. Title is Von deutscher Art in Sprache und Dichtung, which every officer who went on the Russian campaign, I mean, occupying what is today Ukraine, Russia, et cetera, got this book, and they proved the racial superiority of Germans. And these were not just bad, these were some of the best Germanists existing. And you all know, and you know that better than I do, that you had similar phenomena in the Soviet Union, you had similar phenomena. I mean, the point I was making, the humanities were so insecure about themselves they were so eager to fulfill a social function that they really provided everything that the ideological states wanted. And this is what I call the original sin of the humanities. Yeah? My point is, and this is now my fifth point, in a way, that the humanities have never fully recuperated from this original sin. By the way, does everybody follow me? Is this story too long? I'm almost done with the story. Yeah, they hardly ever recuperated. That one reaction that I think is very typical was in the Western countries, not in the state socialist countries, not in the Soviet Union. The time after 1945, when you look what the humanities did in the 1950s and in the early 1960s, they did what is today called immanent interpretation. And that means you exclusively focus on texts, you exclusively focus on artworks, but in a way you draw no social conclusions. You don't want it to have any pedagogical impact. This is immanent interpretation, right? I mean, and this immanent interpretation, I think, was a reaction of abstinence almost, to never fall back into this temptation to serve ideological purposes. A similar move that started, I think, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, was for the humanities to import big philosophical theories. So you could say what started in the 1960s, the first book that became popular was the Anthropologie structurale by Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss came from anthropology in the American and French sense of anthropology, not in the German sense, I mean from ethnology. And there was this importation of structuralism, also of linguistic structuralism from Saussure. So all of a sudden, the humanities had a new theory. And in the humanities, the theories were flourishing. Yeah, there was a reception of neo-Marxism. There was think of the first, I mean, Walter Benjamin. Around 1950, nobody knew Walter Benjamin. All of a sudden, Walter Benjamin became popular. Same with Wittgenstein. There were new theories like reception theory. There were new theories like deconstruction. The point I want to make is that in the 1960s, 1970s, and a little bit still in the 1980s, when I was a student and a young professor, there was this theory explosion in the humanities. So the humanities became quite visible within the university. They were very loud within the university. The humanities also had a certain social resonance, but mainly in the sense that people thought the humanities are crazy. Yeah. I mean, to give you an example, I mean, I've never been a deconstructor, but yes, I have a certain appreciation for Jacques Derrida. But if outside the university, you read the sentence, there is nothing outside the text. Il n'y a pas hors de texte. And that's a serious sentence by Derrida. People think, to use a German word, die sind beknackt. They are completely crazy. I mean, so the point I want to make is that this theory production, I remember as an intellectually fantastic moment within the humanities, a moment that created resonance in society, but negative resonance in society. The final point I want to make is that this theory movement, these theory explosions, a new theory every year, which was fruitful, stopped more or less in the 1980s. I would say since the 1990s, there hasn't been any new theory within the humanities. Yeah? I mean, there have been new fields like media studies, et cetera, but even the foundation of media studies, if you think of people like Marshall McLuhan or in Germany, Friedrich Kittler, I mean, this was something of the 70s, of the 80s. I mean, I actually think, I mean, that's self-critical because I was a professor very young, I mean, definitely in 1990, that the humanities have been stagnant. The humanities have been in a period of 3 decades of stagnation. There is no theory. I mean, they used also to have those political claims in the 60s to be critical, also not taken very seriously outside the humanities. But today, enrollments is going down worldwide. There are much less students enrolling in the humanities. May that be under professional conditions, may that be under college conditions than ever before. the humanities are less funded. And basically, I mean, my Brazilian friends know that it's very strong in Brazil. Everybody in the humanities today is concentrating on identities. Yeah. And that in a way is very tautological. So, okay, I mean, what do I have? I have a Southern German identity. So then I become a Germanist and I tell you how great my Southern German identity is. Or Gracie has a Southern Brazilian identity and is a woman. So she will tell you that women are much superior to men and that Southern Brazilian identity is at least as great as Northern Brazilian identity and much better than Argentine. I mean, I'm giving you a parody, but I think that this identity focus that dominates the humanities today is not terribly productive. I also have nothing terribly against it. Yeah, so, okay. So this was my brief history of the humanities. I don't stop, but I want to ask before I come to my second part. I don't want to discuss this with you, but has this brief history of the humanities been clear? And has it been especially clear to say that we have arrived at a point where after 100 years of thinking about what the humanities are good for, we don't have a convincing answer? And where on top of things, at least, I mean, in the 70s, 80s, the resonance that the humanities got from society was not very positive, but at least they were there. You know what I was saying? If the humanities had disappeared in the 70s, people would have noticed it. Yeah, but if they disappear today, let's face it, I mean, 90% of the people surrounded here are humanists. My friend Osley from Brazil is a lawyer. He's interested in the humanities. That's an exception. But once again, I will claim that if they would die tomorrow, I mean, you know, imagine if, for example, sports, soccer, football would die tomorrow, lots of people who are not interested in sports would notice that. But if the humanities disappear, nobody would notice. Okay, we don't have to debate this, but is it clear what I want to say? Do you see, Roxana or Vadim, does everybody is either bored because it was too much or looks like you're in full agreement? Okay, okay, good. I see the thumbs up by Roxana. That brings me to the second part. What is at stake then in this situation? I mean, once again, I mean, there is this type of rhetoric ever since the humanities have been trying what they're good for around 1900. They've been very loud. I mean, like, the humanities are indispensable. Yeah? I mean, humankind will not continue without the humanities. That's, of course, stupid. I mean, the humankind would easily continue without the humanities. Yeah? I mean, as it had easily had, you know, whatever you want to say, 500,000 years or 25,000 years of existence before the humanities were invented. I mean, that at some point the humanities will come to an end as an institution, that is certain. The question is whether it is now. Now, why is this a dramatic question? I think it is not a dramatic question because humankind will depend on it. It is a dramatic question because plus minus, I mean, that's my estimate. Nobody really says it officially. I think there are worldwide about 2 million people whose income, whose finances depend in the humanities. Yeah? I mean, some of you, I assume Vadim, I know about Gracie, about myself, we made our living. So I have 4 children. So I was feeding this family by making an income in the humanities. And if the humanities would disappear tomorrow, they won't disappear tomorrow, but in the long run, think of somebody like Roxana, I mean, who told me a little bit about her work before this seminar started. It seems very interesting, but at some point you also want food and you want to pay a rental and you want to be able to travel, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really what is at stake. I think at this point, there's no immediate threat. I mean, I was saying if the humanities were shut down tomorrow, nobody wants to shut them down, but the funding is going down. The number of students, the enrollment is going down. And I think, and that's a sad thing, but more than 50 years ago, humanities understand themselves today as institutions of transmission of professional knowledge. Transmission of professional knowledge. So you go to the university to become an engineer. You go to the university to become a doctor. I mean, this is quite interesting because in the United States, what you do first is 4 years of college. After high school, you do college, 4 years of college. And college education traditionally was not meant to be professional education. Professional education you would do at graduate school. So you would do college and then you would go to law school. You would do college and then you would go to medical school. But today it is proven that college students in the United States already conceive of college as pre-professional. And my point is, the more the universities become pre-professional institutions, the less there is a place for the humanities, because there are no profession for the humanities outside the universities. Okay, high school teachers, but as my wife is always saying, I mean, who used to be a high school teacher of languages, I mean, you know, if you teach French and Spanish in Germany or in the United States, you really have no occasion to talk about literature, you talk grammar. I mean, you get my point. There's no professional education outside the university, and that may be the threat for the humanities. So then again, what are the humanities good for? That means, what can society do with the work that people like Roxana, Gracie, Vadim, Gabriel, my friends in Brazil, Bruno, are producing? Many of you are producing. I mean, once again, let me say, I think the standard answers are not convincing. Yeah, I mean, makes people more critical, gives people education and Bildung, gives them ethical standards. I don't believe in that. Yeah, I mean, I also don't, I mean, after having been in the humanities for more than 50 of my 73 years, I don't think that I'm an ethically better person. I mean, sometimes people expect me to be good in morality. I'm not. I'm not a better person than another person. So, and I think we should all forget about that. We also don't know about politics or anything like that. That is I mean, humanists tend to think that, but it's also true. I give you one answer, which is the answer of a former president, rector of Stanford University. His name is John Hennessy, very much like the cognac, John Hennessy. John Hennessy is a world-leading computer scientist. Yeah, I mean, he's very, very important in computer science. John Hennessy has a great sympathy for the humanities. And he once said in an interview with Wall Street Journal, and that is very interesting, Wall Street Journal was saying the enrollment, the number of students in the humanities is going down. And then they asked this president of Stanford, who is a computer scientist, so if the enrollment at the humanities at Stanford would reach zero, no students enrolled in the humanities, would you keep the humanities? And then John Hennessy, to everybody's surprise, I remember it was like 10 years ago, it was a sensation in the US, that they would always keep the humanities. And then the Wall Street Journal journalist asked him, but why would you keep the humanities if the enrollment is zero? And then he gave an answer, which I will use now, and it's an interesting answer, because he says, it is the humanities that make the university into an intellectual place. Without the presence of the humanities, the university is not an intellectual place. And the fact that they are an intellectual place is good for everybody. This is good for me as an engineer. It is good for the people at the medical school. It's good for the people at the law school. It's good for the people in the sciences. Hennessy didn't explain why this was the case, but in the first place, as I got a very positive sign from Roxana and from some others, you seem to like this point of John Hennessy. Once again, I mean, Hennessy was a computer scientist with a sympathy for the humanities, was very strongly supported the humanities at Stanford. And he had a reason. He said it makes the university into an intellectual place. That is the reason why technical universities normally have small humanities. I don't know whether you know what is the highest ranked university in continental Europe, including Ukraine and Russia. It is the Helvetian Technical University, ETH at Zurich. It's a technical university, but the Helvetian Technical University has always had small humanities. So they have a presence of the humanities. Actually, they have very famous humanities. Yeah? They're small, but they have no reason. They have just kept it out of tradition. I was recently, they invited me as an advisor. We were discussing, and then they adapted it a little bit. And that's because we are a technological university. we will have a philosophy of science, or we will have philosophy of technology, or we'll have history of technology. That's a mistake already. I think Stanford de facto is also an engineering university, it's a technical university, but you should have a presence of the humanities, classics, archaeology, Assyriology, you name it, to make them into an intellectual place. Okay, that is a nice answer, and Roxana likes it. But what would that exactly mean, to make them into an intellectual place? It's not clear what that means. I think I see that in your faces, some of you agree. I mean, A, the presence of the humanities makes the university into an intellectual place, and B, that's good, that's inspiring for everybody. But that's not good enough for an explanation. So let me try to give you an explanation. I start this explanation, which will lead to the concept of riskful thinking, with a German thinker who people normally refer to as a sociologist. I think he was much more a philosopher, really. And this is Niklas Luhmann, L-U-H-M-A-N-N. Niklas Luhmann, who is normally associated with the creation, the invention of the theory of social systems. Now, when Luhmann talks about social systems, he has a formula. What is the general function of social systems, of all social systems? That can be the state, that can be the educational system, that can be the legal system, whatever. That they normally reduce complexity for us. Yeah? I mean, we humans, different from animals who have instincts, would not be able to survive in our environment, in our natural environment, without institutions that reduce complexity for us. And what is reducing complexity? It means we always have too many possibilities, and institutions tell us what to do. For example, if you drive a car, you could drive on the left and you could drive on the right. But if everybody individually drives either on the left or the right, you have many, many accidents. So you need an institution, that's the state in that case, to tell you, okay, in England or Japan, you drive on the left, in the United States and Ukraine, you drive on the right. I mean, this is what institutions are doing. And in that sense, you can say that institutions always solve problems. So the problem of traffic, for example, I'm obsessed with traffic because the first traffic code in Germany was introduced in 1926. This is the year when Heidegger wrote Being and Time, Sein und Zeit. And if you look in Sein und Zeit, Heidegger never possessed a car, but there are lots of traffic rules examples in Sein und Zeit. And this is just the fact that it was the year that for the first time they said you can only drive a car on the right. So you get my point. This was an illustration of what it means to say that social systems, the function of social systems is to reduce complexity. Yeah, they as institutions, they reduce complexity for us. I mean, as I see my friend Osley, who is a prosecutor in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul in Brazil, I mean, the Brazilian legal system functions in different ways from the Ukrainian legal system, the German legal system, but they both, or they all, cover possibilities. Say if somebody steals, that person will be punished. We're punished in a different way in Brazil from the way it will be punished in the Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. But legal systems reduce complexity. Yeah, medical systems reduce complexity and thereby solve problems. Is that clear so far? Now Luhmann says there is one social system, however, that instead of reducing complexity, increases complexity. There is one system that instead of solving problems, creates problems. There is one system that makes the world more complex and also more complicated. And Luhmann says this is what he calls das Wissenschaftssystem, the science system. So he does not say this exclusively for the humanities, but he includes certainly the sciences, he includes certainly the social sciences. I would say he's probably right, because if you think of discoveries in the sciences, let's say in chemistry or in physics or in biology, they do not normally solve problems. right? I mean, they make our worldview more complex, more complicated, and then they can be used by medicine, by engineering to solve problems. But it is certainly true for the humanities. It is certainly true for the humanities. I mean, you know, I have a certain skepticism with the concept of research in the humanities. I think when we say we do research, that's an analogy from the sciences. We do not really do research. I like to describe what we do in the humanities as secular contemplation because it's not necessarily religious. And what does contemplation mean? Contemplation means that you are able to concentrate on something. Like, for example, as Gracie is working now on Machado de Assis, which is the greatest Brazilian author, Brazilian classic, who has very beautiful short stories. So you are able to concentrate on one short story or on 3 short stories of Machado de Assis. Then secondly, secular contemplation, and we do that in the humanities, few people talk about it, we normally come back to these things. Yeah? I mean, if you are a Machado de Assis specialist, as Gracie is, you don't read that text once and say, now I know the text. No, you come back to the text. Come back to the text that you know the most. Or as a historian or as a philosopher, you come back to the French Revolution because you know it the most. And each time that you come back, you do not really solve problems. I mean, you make that view more complex. You make that view more complex. Yeah, this is what I think we do in the humanities. We make the world more complex. We establish, and what is the value of that? Well, we establish a potential, a horizon of alternatives. Do those alternatives have to be applied? I don't care. But let's say I read a philosophical text, Heidegger, for example, in my book on 1926, in a way that's different from most people, from how most people have read Heidegger, that opens new possibilities of understanding Heidegger. Or, I mean, as Gracie knows, or some of the Brazilians know, I have a different perspective, not being Brazilian, on some periods of Brazilian culture that opens new possibilities. So, I mean, you get my point. What I want to make is the hypothesis is the humanities make the world and our way of seeing the world more complex, more complicated, and thereby establish a horizon that keeps societies flexible. So we don't change societies, but we keep thoughts, we keep perspectives to keep them flexible. This is, by the way, the reason why people from outside the humanities find us normally so weird. And for the right reasons. I mean, we are people, I mean, you know, when I'm sitting here at this table with my family for dinner sometimes, and then you always come up with strange ideas. Yes, in a way, that's exactly what we're doing. We come up with strange ideas. We establish, you could say, an archive of strange ideas. Now, this is exactly what I mean by riskful thinking. And why do I call it riskful thinking? Let me give you an example, and then I will about be finished. Imagine the following situation. So I see Vadim, who listens in a very concentrated way to me. Now, if all of a sudden, now his face becomes more dramatic, and if all of a sudden he would hold the left part of his belly and all of a sudden say, oh, I have a very acute pain, we would all think he has appendicitis. And Roxana would call the emergency number in California, that would be 911. And then a doctor would come, an ambulance would bring him to the hospital, and there's a surgeon, and the surgeon says, this is not appendicitis, even peritonitis, the very dangerous form. And then just before you go into anesthesia, Vadim, they will tell you, and you are very lucky, says the surgeon, because today I will try out for the first time in my life a new access to the appendix. So you are lucky because you are the first patient on which I'm trying out this new method. You would not like that, right? Because you would think the risk is much higher. But at the same time, we want that medical research exists. Yeah? We want that medicine makes progress. So you get my point. I mean, whenever you establish these new ideas, whenever you establish these new possibilities, whenever you make the world more complicated, to immediately institutionalize these new views would be dangerous. I mean, this is why you don't want this surgeon to try out a new access to the appendix on you, but you want him to try out a new access to the appendix. And this is precisely why I think that if universities make the world more complex, or if thinking and research makes the world more complex, including the sciences, it is a good thing that the universities are at a distance from society. There's a metaphor for this called the ivory tower. The ivory tower is negative. I mean, the university is a tower out of ivory. It never penetrates into society, but I think this is a good thing. I think we should not constantly try to impose our solutions to the world. Yeah, I mean, for example, what I find out, think, produce in complexity, thinking about politics may be an alternative that people can think about. But that doesn't mean that I have to found a political party and tell the world what to do. Yeah, I mean, Gracie, in Brazil, I think most colleagues misunderstand that being a humanist comes with the obligation to support a party, and that is the party that was formerly the party of Lula. I have a sympathy for Lula, I have a sympathy for that party, but I would never consider it my task to support that with my work. You get my point about riskful thinking. I mean, what we think about, if you immediately institutionalize it, could imply a risk. So we just produce that as a repertoire. Let me finish on one very Californian example, how the humanities can have a resonance, but do not necessarily have a resonance. And you may be surprised, this is by a very famous colleague from the other great Californian universities. The most famous universities in California are in that order: Stanford and Berkeley. Of course, I'm saying Stanford and Berkeley because I'm at Stanford. And normally as a Stanford professor, you talk very badly about Berkeley professors, and as a Berkeley professor, you talk very badly about Stanford professors. But I will speak very positively about a Berkeley professor. And that Berkeley professor is Judith Butler. I don't know whether you know, I mean, the world leading feminist thinker. I mean, definitely the most famous feminist thinker in the world. My younger son, who is studying at Arizona State, he was recently asking me, listen, there's one name, I cannot write any exam without having read her books. Is that your friend Judith Butler? I said, yes, this is Judith Butler. So now it is interesting to see that Judith Butler, in the 1980s, 1990s, with two books, Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter, really invented as a philosopher a completely new concept of gender or sex. I mean, at that point, this distinction that today everybody makes between sex and gender didn't exist. This was a time when she started where feminist philosophers were thinking about the essence of being a woman. They were very, very binary. And Judith Butler was, I'm not saying necessarily the first, but one of the first who said, well, what Geschlecht, what gender really is not a biological difference. It is not a binary difference, but it is a role. It is a form of performance. Yeah, you become, in her case, a lesbian woman who is a sports fan. That's what she is, by behaving this way. And sometimes it's not easy to behave this way, but these are roles. And this is not a binarism, but there's a continuum. There's an endless number of roles, and you can also switch between the roles. You can start your life being whatever, straight man, and then you can become gay, and then you can try to become lesbian, whatever. I can tell you, I'm old enough that when I was reading Bodies That Matter was the first book I read first, I thought that's a little bit crazy. I mean, I'm saying that because today, I think this has globally become what cultivated people think about sex and gender. It's no longer eccentric. So I'm not saying that Judith Butler has changed the world, but that is a very good example where something that originally was really riskful thinking within the humanities all of a sudden had a huge resonance. Yeah? I mean, the book Gender Trouble sold more than 200,000 copies worldwide. And for a philosophical book, that's quite sensational. Yeah? So Judith Butler has had a resonance. I mean, for example, the Navy, the US Navy 10 years ago, changed their rules for admitting women to the Navy as officers. And they were officially, I mean, the legal grounding of their argumentation was Judith Butler. Yeah. Now, my point is, and I know her well enough, Judith did not necessarily write Gender Trouble or Bodies That Matter to tell the American Navy what to do. You get my point? So here's somebody in the humanities produced alternative ideas, and these alternative ideas found a huge resonance, and that is glorious, and I'm very proud of it, and I think it's a good thing. But my final point is, and this I want to conclude, whether this happens or not, whether we have a political impact or not, is not or social impact, is not something that we can decide. I think we should concentrate on secular contemplation. We should produce alternative thoughts, and what quote unquote society does with it, it's none of our business. I mean, Judith Butler was then consulted by the Navy. She talked about it, but you get my point. We should produce riskful thinking and should not be so concerned with having social influence. And I hope that you all disagree with that, because then we will have 15 minutes of good discussion. I thank you so much for your attention.
Спасибо большое профессору Гумбрехту. Так, друзья, есть ли вопросы? Просьба писать вопросы в чат, если это на русском или украинском языке, а Оксана переведет. Если вы хотите туда.
Связь была не очень, поэтому я повторю. Если кто-то хочет задать вопрос напрямую, пожалуйста, нажимайте «Поднять руку» и задавайте. Если вы хотите, чтобы ваш вопрос перевели, напишите его просто в чат, потом вы можете все равно его задать, чтобы вас профессор увидел, просто чтобы мне было легче переводить, если у меня перед глазами будет непосредственно ваш вопрос, если есть такая возможность. Кто начнет?
Why don't you have a question, Roxana and Vadim? That would be good to start.
Well, let's start with Vadim.
Да, но у меня такой вопрос. В одном из своих интервью, и вот сегодня эта мысль также частично прозвучала, вы противопоставляете рискованное мышление повседневной жизни. И вот у меня вопрос в связи с этим. Не ставит ли такая позиция гуманитария в некий такой экзистенциальный кризис, такой тотальный экзистенциальный кризис перед повседневностью и обыденностью, и нормализацией?
In one of your texts, and today this thought had been said already, you're talking about riskful thinking as an opposite of the regular life and the practice of riskful thinking in the university. And the question is, doesn't it put the humanities scholar in a different existential position, position of constant and total confrontation with the regular, common, and normal.
I'll try to give short answers, though that this is a super interesting question. It's a question for a book, but nevertheless, I mean, in the first place, and I've already mentioned that in general, seen from outside, people in the humanities tend to be eccentric. I mean, you don't have to necessarily be eccentric. I mean, if you want to be too eccentric, it's crazy. But I would say, for example, the number of men my age in the humanities who have tattoos or wear earrings or nose rings is much higher in the humanities than outside. And I will say there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah, I mean, also the fact that the proportion of, I mean, seemingly worldwide, people assume that the proportion of homosexual people is plus minus 10% in the population. I mean, it's an estimate. It's definitely high in the humanities worldwide. I'm neither claiming that this is the glory, oh my God, we are the avant-garde of sexual trans sex or whatever, but nor is it a bad thing. Yeah? I mean, I think this is what we are good at. I mean, this is why, you know, certain people in eccentric situations are in the humanities. I mean, I would, for example, I'm not Jewish myself, but I would give you an estimate that worldwide, if you say that among the 2 million humanists, there are 500 who are world stars, I would guess that among those 500 who are world stars, 250 or 300 are Jewish. I'm not Jewish, once again, but why is there an affinity? Because perhaps growing up as a Jew in most societies, you already grow up in a peripheral position. You get my point? So there is, according to what I'm saying, the strength of the humanities is to be, to a certain degree, eccentric. You don't have to think about that constantly. I don't wake up and say, oh, today I try green lipstick or something like that. But, you know, for example, I'm driving a very old car. I'm driving a 1989 Jeep Wrangler. Why am I driving this? Because I've always dreamed to have a Jeep, because when I grew up in Germany under American occupation, the coolest car was a Jeep. And I don't feel I have to change that car. I'm not cultivating that, but so in a way, and this goes to your question, Vadim, I do think that if we manage to make it clear to university administrations that our strength is riskful thinking, we have a more powerful argument. It's a risk. There's a risk in this argument. But we have a more powerful argument than if we pretend we can solve problems which we are not good at. I don't think that, you know, I mean, to quote something super famous, I mean, Erich Auerbach, who is certainly one of the greatest literary critics who ever existed, I mean, Erich Auerbach had a very poor analysis of the Nazi situation in Germany. I mean, he believed that the Nazi government would stick to the standards of German law, because he was also a lawyer. And he only left Germany when he had to physically leave Germany. And this was in 1937, after the Nuremberg laws, the Jews had to leave Germany if possible. Yeah, you get my point. I mean, I don't think that when humanities scholars have tried to give practical solutions, that was very typical for my generation, the 60s, all these political proposals, they were ever very good doing that. I mean, of course they can say something political, but I think our strength that we should cultivate is to provide alternative views. That's why we deal with the past. That's why you do archaeology, because this Babylonian society, the more we know it, the more we see very, very different ways that people could live together. And that doesn't mean that we have to implement those ways, but you could also say it expands our imagination. And once again, I see this is difficult to say, but our normal strategy of convincing administrations that we are good at problem solving, I mean, has not worked in more than 100 years.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Я же могу это не переводить, потому что у нас очень мало времени. Очень длинный ответ просто был.
Да,
There's
это
several
нормально.
chats. Yeah, okay.
It's okay.
Who's next?
Валентина и Дарья задавали вопросы в чате. Вы хотите, допустим, Валентина первая задала?
Yeah, I can, sorry, but I cannot turn on the camera. So first of all, thanks a lot for your great lecture. It was really interesting for me. And the question.
I like you.
So, as you were describing your concept of riskful thinking, I was just thinking, are there any parallels? So can we compare what you call riskful thinking as Thomas Kuhn in his approach has when the science is in the crisis and there are some issues that cannot no longer be approached by traditional solutions. So some new approaches are proposed. So can we compare this period and these approaches to riskful thinking? So can we call it riskful thinking? And are there some similarities or not? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas Kuhn, who was super important when I was relatively young. And so, I mean, it was one of the authors who I first read when I was starting to think about the profession. Thomas Kuhn never talks about the humanities in specific. I think you can expect from so riskful thinking, here's the answer, short answer. I have been using this concept both in my talk today and in some things I've written specifically for the humanities. I mean, if you remember when I was quoting Luhmann, who doesn't use the word riskful thinking, but Luhmann had this idea that the science system increases complexity. In a sense, therefore, he applies riskful thinking for the entire university. And this is my answer to your question. I think that, it's my impression from outside, engineering, science, humanities, there's a degree of being problem-solving oriented or not. Yeah? I mean, engineering is normally problem-solving oriented. This is the reason why engineering was not part of the university until the early 19th century. And while until the present day, those universities with much engineering call themselves technical universities, and some people think they are not real universities, right? I mean, Stanford is de facto a technical university, but doesn't call itself technical university because that sounds bad. You get my point. This may come from the humanities. So the sciences, normally when you write a science research project, you know much more what exactly you want to find out than a humanist writing a research project. Yeah? So there is a degree, I think this riskful thinking, this only producing complexity is very much and almost 100% typical for the humanities. But it doesn't mean that there is a certain degree of riskful thinking in every university. I mean, in every university discipline. Maybe this is what the former Stanford president Hennessy meant when he said, the universities cannot be an intellectual place without the humanities. Maybe the humanities, to put it this way, are the origin, the dwell of riskful thinking, but maybe it is, to use a metaphor, contagious. So it is good for the sciences, it is good for engineering, it is good even for theology to practice riskful thinking to a certain degree. I thank you very much, Valentina, for this question, because I never thought about it, and I think it is important. It would be the question of the degree of riskful thinking in different parts of the university.
Yes, thanks a lot. And just a small comment, I'm also studying identities in Ukraine. So you were absolutely right about this, like a boom of identity studies. So it is indeed a very famous topic now among humanities.
I mean, it's not a bad thing to think about identities, but I think sometimes it is that every identity is, I mean, so if you're an African-American studies, this is the best of American culture, which I sometimes think it is, but nevertheless, and then you are in, I don't know, in Jewish culture, oh my God, this is incomparable. But in the end, it comes down to a kind of banal competition that all identities are great and then they all wanted the gold medal. And I think it's become a little bit monochrome in the humanities. I mean, there are other problems that are not identity problems. I mean, it's fine that there are gay studies, but at this point, I mean, as Richard Rorty once says, because I'm looking at a gay friend here on the screen, I mean, Richard Rorty once said the fight for gay rights will only be won if we don't need Christopher Street days anymore. Yeah? I mean, as long as you have to celebrate something, it is not yet on the level where you want it to be. Yeah, somebody wants to be gay as you want to be. That's, I think, the status. And that's the same with identities. If you want to appreciate Singaporean identity, do it, go for it. But we don't have to fight for it.
Okay, do we have time for a couple more questions?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, two, because I like to be here.
Daria?
Thank you very much. I'd rather prefer not to switch on my camera. So thank you very much, Professor Gumbrecht, for a very fascinating, thought-provoking, brilliant, inspiring lecture. I can actually bring as many adjectives as I can, but my question will be, you said that your idea about the universities, that universities should keep as far from the society as possible in as high ivory tower as possible sounds really tempting. But how will the society know they need us and need to finance us if we don't mess up with them from time to time? No,
it's difficult. I mean, this seems to be the I mean, Vadim had a similar question. It is difficult, but I think historically you can say, I mean, in 100 years of trying to prove that we are important for societies, we have never been successful. Yeah? I mean, we have never been proving that we really solve serious problems. I mean, yes, we once solved problems in the 1930s and 1930s in Nazi Germany, but we would have better not try to solve that problem to convince German officers why they were racially superior to people in the Ukraine, for example. I mean, so this is not, so I get your point. Everybody outside the humanities is used to us saying that we are terribly important. Nobody takes us seriously. There might be a risk, but why not be sincere and be sincere with us too? And say, I mean, I'm deliberately exaggerating. What we are really good at is at being weird. Is it being strange? I mean, is in producing ideas. And it's also not that every strange idea you ever produce is a great idea, but that our function can, I mean, this is why I was quoting this John Hennessy idea. I mean, when I was saying that, I had the impression that everybody whom I can see on the screen did agree. It's true. Universities are not an intellectual place without the humanities. And why? Because we have that certain degree of weirdness. Yeah. And Daria, I see the risk of saying that, but that is one answer. The other answer is, I mean, when I was saying the ivory tower, I'm not saying we have to completely close up. Of course, I mean, look, given my age and stuff, I write a lot for good newspapers. Sometimes, I mean, it's also paid. It's well paid. That's also a reason. But I do like to be in a contact with society. But what I have strictly given up in that sense is this complex. It's ultimately an inferiority complex that I can tell society where to go. I mean, you know, I've had enough problems of telling my 4 children more or less where to go and how to lead their lives. I've not been very successful. My children are very successful, but I think it's difficult enough to be a father. I certainly don't think that I have any vocation of telling 7.5 billion humans where to go. And that's what humanists have been doing crazily for 100 years. Yeah.
Thanks.
Talk about Brazil, we have Brazilians. Yes, I don't like the present Brazilian president Bolsonaro, but there are enough people in the world who dislike him, hopefully enough people in Brazil to dislike him. So this is not something I'm good at. Yeah, I mean, yes, I can say that in a private conversation, but I would not like it. I would not write a newspaper article, let alone a book on why I dislike Bolsonaro. I mean, as a citizen, if I was a Brazilian citizen, I could do that. And I can, when we talk, Gracie and I, or Slay and I can say that, and we can disagree on it. Okay, this last question.
Okay, then Bruno wants to ask a question. He wrote me in person here.
All right, thank you so much for this. This was great, and thank you for inviting me. I think my question goes a little like with Daria and Vadim. I want to emphasize the idea of the spaces. I think really interesting that you mentioned that the humanities kind of replace this immanence, this transcendental idea that used to be occupied by religion. And I was thinking like, when you say like, there's 2 million people in the humanities in the world, and if we disappear today, no one's gonna notice. And then I was thinking also about like religion and how the Catholic Church is struggling so much in having people in the churches. And there is always this idea when you go to church, like you're going to kind of like try to reach God, but it's something always unreachable. Yeah. And we go to the humanities and it's this dog chasing his own tail, right? It's always an unfinished kind of job. And I wonder if like the space that we occupy, either like in the religion space or academic space, how does this like impact the way that society react to this kind of situation, right? Because if we disappear today, society will not even notice. But it's interesting because we could only become, the intellectual ideal in the intellect, like the Greek Academy was only possible because it was outside of the city.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah, look, I mean, this is, it's interesting. This is always good when I have a discussion, and there's clearly a vanishing perspective, right? I mean, most questions, I mean, Darius too, go in this reaction. Let me say one thing that I didn't make clear enough. I mean, I hope and I think that there's something about my hypothesis and Wolfgang Iser's hypothesis that you were quoting, that the humanities in their foundation in the 19th century were fulfilling the role of producing something like a secular transcendence, right? A secular metaphysics, so to speak. They didn't think about that, but that's what they were doing. And I mean, they were altogether successful, whether it was for the better of those societies or not, but they received a degree of respect. It is also the time of the expansion of the humanities. I mean, in most countries, all countries like in Brazil in the late 19th century, Spain even in the late 19th, they tried to catch up, we need the humanities. Nobody really knew what they did, but it was that function. Now, I should have made it clearer that I think this is today not what we can do. Yeah, this is today not what we can do. And I would again say the main function is perhaps, pragmatically speaking, what John Hennessy was saying. Yeah, I mean, to make the university into an intellectual place. So if the humanities are good in that sense, to make the university, to keep the universities being an intellectual place, that would already be pretty good, because if Hennessy is right, that would make engineering, medicine, biology, et cetera, better. That also, I think, would probably lead worldwide to reduction of positions in the humanities. I have to say, sometimes, specifically in Brazil, and this is a consequence of the Lula times, I mean, I would say in Brazil and state universities, that's what I'm saying, you hardly ever go to any state university without meeting a couple of very intelligent, very interesting people. But I always think you have twice as many people in each department as should be there on a payroll. You get my point? I mean, I sometimes think that it's still this idea that the humanities are super important, that it would be good for the humanities maybe if it was worldwide 1 million people and not 2 million people. And final remark, and this is something, I mean, I'm now thinking about, perhaps the humanities on a college level, that would be a very American idea, would be a place where aesthetic experience can take place. Not in the sense that you can teach aesthetic experience. Aesthetic experience can only be an individual event. Yeah? You listen to Mozart or you listen to contemporary rap, and either something happens to you, either you get a vibration or not. Nobody can teach that. But perhaps the humanities could become a place where young people are exposed to that type of experience. Just reciting a poem, listen to a Hölderlin poem or listen to a Ginsberg poem, right? Can become exposed to that, not in the sense of teaching, but to see how they react to that. So that has nothing to do with riskful thinking, but that could be another function which on this college level, the humanities could perhaps play. I don't know how that could function institutionally, but that's for your generation, the next generation to solve. Now I have to really leave. I mean, I wanted to thank Vadim for the idea. I wanted to thank Roxana for beautiful English. I wanted to thank everybody for these questions. And I mean, in a way, and I mean it, you have played a little bit for me the role that John Hennessy was saying the humanities should play. I mean, some of you were saying this is, I know that people in Ukraine are polite, but that they liked the talk. I mean, I have to say that those faces that I could see here on the screen, I could never see them all. They were very inspiring. You seem to be interested. And the fact that some of your questions brought up a really new perspectives for me made it very, very worthwhile. So many thanks. Please invite me live because I also love the food in Ukraine. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Professor
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to our international guests. And now we'll switch to Ukrainian. Всем присутствующим также большое спасибо. Большое спасибо кафедре медиакомуникаций социологического факультета Каразинского университета за техническое оснащение и медийную поддержку. И, конечно, спасибо всем, кто донейтил нам на то, чтобы мы могли осуществлять свою деятельность.